Welcome. Hi, this is a great crowd. I see some repeat faces, which I'm excited about. Um, so thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation, which is the third in our series of talks on the historic San Juan Hill neighborhood. And for those of you who haven't heard, it's part of this whole series is part of a larger project called Legacies of San Juan Hill, which is dedicated to exploring the history and the communities and the cultural legacy of the neighborhood that existed in this area in the first half of the 20th century, so in and around the area where Lincoln Center resides today. Our wonderful project collaborators for the whole project are the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. We have some representatives here. And so tonight's conversation, as you know, is focused on Latin jazz and the music that was created in and around San Juan Hill roughly 100 years ago. And Centro is our co-presenter for this event this evening. And then without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening. I'm going to tell you a bit of his exciting accolades, and then we'll welcome him to the stage. So he is a writer and photographer at the New York Times Metro Desk. Since arriving at the Times in 1990 from Newsweek magazine, he has served as the paper's Bronx bureau chief, Metro religion writer, About New York columnist, and the Central America Caribbean bureau chief. His work is often focused on New York City neighborhoods and how they reflect the larger social and cultural issues in American society. Please welcome to the stage, David Gonzalez.
I'd like to thank Lincoln Center. You know, looking over the essays and the photos on that website, the wonderful website they have here that is dedicated to examining and appreciating the various legacies of this community and the once vibrant community that preceded this whole complex here. I came across that well-known photo of candidate Ronald Reagan standing in front of a Charlotte Street building in the Bronx where my friend John Fechner had stenciled "Broken Promises." It's an apt photo to start a discussion on the effects of unbridled urban development, or, entre comillas, renewal, urban renewal, which was really removal. Or in the case of the South Bronx, officially sanctioned abandonment. Yes, my childhood. But these things, you know, glib remarks aside, echo through urban generations to this very day, to this minute as we speak. As someone who grew up in a working class community that was scattered to the four winds during the fires of the 1970s, I also know the role that culture plays in sustaining us during those trying times. It anchors us, it soothes us, it excites us, it makes us move. Most importantly, it reminds us of who we are. Music, as I saw in my own family's lives, my father and his four brothers were all Jibaros from Caguas, who all came here as teenagers to work in factories. My mother came here she was told she was going to go to high school. She wound up cleaning houses. But she was told, el dinero está en la calle como lechuga. That, you know, the money was in the street like lettuce to be picked. Of course, we know those were false. But what I saw in my father's own family, my father's extended family, my uncles, was the one thing my father and his brothers brought from Puerto Rico and nurtured it. And they played it here in the South Bronx in living rooms or picnics at Orchard. Guys dressed to the nines, suits, ties, fedoras. They worked in basements. They worked cleaning up people's messes. But on the weekend, they dressed like George freaking Raft and picked up guitars and sang. And they sang the kind of boleros that the duo that was here before was playing. Just gorgeous guitar. 2 guitars and 2 voices. Stuff that would blow you away. Guys who were janitors, factory workers, could sing songs with such elaborate poetry in Spanish at a time when we had a Romanian playing a Mexican named Jose Jimenez on TV. You know, when you see the reality in your living room, it's really hard to accept people trying to pass it off as something that pertains to your culture. But it was that gift of music that I saw right front and center was one of the most valuable gifts my parents ever gave me and my siblings. I did not get the talent of playing. That skips generations. My oldest daughter plays guitar and piano and actually was in the Very Young Composers program here. I only learned how to play records, unfortunately. I try. Well, music informs my writing. But what is also true about our communities is the interaction on the street, in schools, or at parties with many other cultures, and in New York, for Nuyoricans, especially with our black brothers and sisters. You know, we shared the same schools, the same buildings, for better or worse, And we shared each other's cultures, whether it was food, whether it was music. You could see the flowering that in the 60s with the Boogaloo movement. You know, I mean, that was, and then you could see all these other bands like King Nando, which had like my friend Joel Dreyfus, who's a Haitian-American journalist now in Paris. But Homeboy played bass in that band back in the 60s. But that introduction, there was an interplay, a dialogue that enriched us both. I like to see it as survival through solidarity, cultural and otherwise, especially otherwise, I think, as we look back on this. And that's my little contribution, mi granito, if you will, for this discussion. I'd like to bring up one by one the members of the panel, and I will read your bios, and come on up. Bobby Sanabria, come on up. I don't know if you want to sit by your kit. Okay. Bobby Sanabria is a drummer, percussionist, composer, arranger, documentary film producer, and a multi-Grammy nominated leader. So, of course, he's a Nuyorican son of the Bronx. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Cardinal Hayes Memorial High School for Boys in the Grand Concourse, where we both attended and graduated in '75. So some of those street beats you're going to hear later, we used to hear them at football games against Stepanak when we were 15. This guy, and the other thing you don't know about Bobby is, as good a drummer as he is, he was a better runner. No, this is no lie. I'm dead serious. He was an amazing distance runner, to be honest. He has performed and recorded with Dizzy Gillespie, Tito Puente, Mongo Santamaria, Paquito de Rivera, Charles McPherson, and the father of Afro-Cuban jazz, Mario Bauza. His big band albums have all been nominated for Grammys, and his numerous awards include the 2018 Jazz Education Network's Legends of Latin Jazz Award and an honorary doctorate from Lehman College. He is on the faculty of the New School University and hosts the Latin Jazz Cruise on WBGO-FM. His new album with his multiverse big band, Vox Humana, features Janice Siegel from the Manhattan Transfer, Antoinette Montague, and Jennifer Jade Ledesma. Welcome, Bobby Sanabria. Next up, Chris Washburn. Come on down. Chris is professor of music at Columbia University, chair of the music department, and the founder of Columbia's Louis Armstrong Jazz Performance Program. He has published numerous articles on jazz, Latin jazz, and salsa. His books include Bad Music, The Music We Love to Hate, Sounding Salsa, Performing Latin Music in New York, and Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz. As a trombonist, he has performed in over 150 recordings, 2 Grammy winners, and 7 Grammy-nominated recordings. Welcome, Chris. And our last participant is Antoinette Aguilar. Come on up. Annette, I'm sorry. Aquí te fastidié ya. I'm still thinking of Antoinette Montague.
She's great.
Yeah. Annette Aguilar is a multi-percussionist, recording artist, educator, producer, and band leader. She was the principal timpanist for the Bronx Symphony from 1997 to 2013. She was selected as a Latin jazz ambassador by a panel that included no less than Ray Barretto and Hilton Ruiz. May they both rest in peace. She formed her Latin jazz, Brazilian, and salsa group, Annette A. Aguilar and String Beans, in 1992, and they have performed at festivals and venues across the United States, including the Kennedy Center. She's also worked on several Grammy Award-winning Broadway shows, including In the Heights, The Cape Man, and Darrell Walters' Street Corner Symphony. In 2014, she started the Women in Latin Jazz Festival to uplift female instrumentalists and promote diversity in the field. Welcome, Annette. So, we can get started. I write everything. I'm a writer, so I'm sorry I'm shuffling papers, but that's what I do. To get started, let's start with Chris. We were talking earlier about maybe setting the stage for the discussion and giving us a bit of the backstory, if you will, the history that sets us up before 1920 in this neighborhood and the music.
Delighted. Hello, everyone. Hi. It's such an honor to be asked here and to see an old friend. Thank you so much for having us, and especially for the topic. which is wonderful. Probably one of the first times this topic has been discussed on this block. And so, so this is fabulous. But speaking about this neighborhood, I think that in order to understand the significance of San Juan Hill and also Latin music in New York City, we have to go back in time a little bit. Actually, we have to go back to the year 1716. That was the year of the birth of Latin jazz. It was way before even a thing that we call jazz now even existed. And it was the moment where what we have today started. In that year, in the Louisiana territory in New Orleans, it was the first time that enslaved peoples were brought in. And there were 3,500 of them that were brought in, all of West African heritage. But the thing is they came into New Orleans, and at that time New Orleans just had like a couple thousand people, so they far outnumbered the people in that entire region. But they weren't from West Africa. They were from Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. So Saint-Domingue, of course, is the island that's now known as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so what that meant was that early on, the largest population in that entire region was Caribbean. And with them, they brought their Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Creole cultures and cultural practices. As New Orleans grew, it became one of the largest port cities of that century in North America. It became a central location for a variety of different trade, but it also became the kind of key center for the way that West African culture was brought into this continent. And we see over and over again, every 25 to 50 years, kind of this re-Africanization of different cultures coming in to this area. Now, what's unique about New Orleans, for those of you who've traveled there, the people, they speak differently, they eat different cuisine, and the music sounds different. Why? Because for all intents and purposes, it's a Caribbean city. It was ruled by the Spanish for many years and then the French. And that's significant because it was really the only place that for consistently over a lot of years that the West African peoples that were brought in were able on Sunday afternoons to actually perpetuate their traditions. And Congo Square was one of the places. It was an open-air market, and it was where people could continue these practices. The practices that all the account, there was no recording technology back there, so we don't know necessarily what the music sounded like. But there were a lot of travelers' reports, and there was also a very important composer, Louis Gottschalk, who transcribed what he heard. And there was one rhythm that he transcribed that was of interest to us. It was referred by the local peoples as the bambula. And the bambula's rhythm sounds like this. For most of you that are under the age of 30, that's like, damn, that's reggaeton. You're right. For those of you that are a little older, they're like, that sounds like yeah, it's the tango rhythm. It's also known as the habanera rhythm, and it's also known as imbilo hamakinu in the Congolese languages, which is a call to dance. So it was a West African tradition that was extended, and there were documents of this rhythm being the most popular and also played the longest in that period. It's very interesting that we see that rhythm come up as the national rhythms of Cuba in the habanera, or also in Argentina as tango. And strategically, those in the kind of post-colonial era, when those nations became free, they were trying to establish national musics that would assert their difference from their European colonizers. And so what did they turn to? They turned to rhythms that were indigenous to their regions, these Afro-Creole and Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latin rhythms, to signify difference and their national sound. So now we need to zip a little bit farther ahead, because what does New Orleans have to do with this neighborhood here? Well, what's interesting is that one of the first Latin dance crazes that actually came and was played in this neighborhood was the tango dance craze in the 1910s. And so it is that legacy where we get this Latin dance slowly emerging, especially in this neighborhood, read white, in the 1910s, amongst audiences that were having a growing appetite for exoticism, for the music of the other. But they were also listening to like early pre-jazz as well. And of course, the early jazz that comes out of New Orleans is infused with rhythms like do, da, dit, do. Or if you just take the one dit out of there, it's boom, doom, got, doom, got, doom. The tresillo rhythm, it's also what you hear in the New Orleans brass band traditions, and it's throughout early jazz, and it's oftentimes in the shout choruses and the hot jazz recordings of the 1920s. And that's not a coincidence. The rhythm and the rhythmic underpinnings of jazz are Caribbean in nature. And it's the reason why in the 1930s, Jelly Roll Morton started talking about the Spanish tinge in jazz. For the right flavor and the right spice, you needed to have these Spanish rhythms. And he was referring to the Spanish-speaking countries of the Caribbean and Central and South America when he was talking about that. Duke Ellington also talked about that as well, and many of the early jazz musicians did. But this is the way Latin music came in to this country. But then, in the research of my book, I came across, and I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong, I came across a very interesting thing. As this growing interest of otherness and exoticism came, and even primitivist movements in art, it was also in popular music and dance forms. So that's one of the reasons the tango was so popular here, because it was just different enough that it was a way of feeling a bit cosmopolitan, maybe being a little titillating with this exotic dance from someplace else. But then there was this performance space that it was a big dance hall, and it was called the Paradise Ballroom in New York City, and it was right here at Columbus Circle in the same place that Jazz at Lincoln Center now sits, which is totally cool. And it was one of the main performance venues for the top acts of the day in popular music. But they used to have these Sunday dances. And so they started to cater to popular tastes. And this is from March 9th, 1917. And it is it is billed as, the event is titled Seance Tea Dances, and promises of an entire novelty, with activities that include gypsy crystal gazing, Ouija boards, and the original jazz dance, and the Cuban danzon.
I'll pay money for that, man.
Damn straight. Maybe we should reenact that for your next record. Yeah, exactly. And it says, will be introduced by Miss Parrott and Mr. Anderson, accompanied by none other, the musical entertainment of the day. Get ready. The original Dixieland Jazz Band. This was one of their first tours up north after the very first recordings of jazz. They were here to play the music that they recorded, the Tiger Rag and a bunch of the other hits that were, and this was 5 white guys from New Orleans copying black music. And very good musicians. Not that much improvisation was going on, but they were up here in New York, not only playing jazz, but Cuban danzon. And this was totally normal for a New Orleans band. But up here, it was kind of billed and tied into this exotica. But it was very popular and very successful. So their first gig here, they were playing Latin jazz. But they didn't record any danzons, because it was the popular music of the day down in New Orleans, but that's not what people wanted to hear up north, because that didn't really play into the black music that was coming from New Orleans that they wanted to package and sell and co-opt. So the history of recorded jazz doesn't quite reflect actually what was going on in the bandstands. But these New Orleans innovators were clearly versed, not only in what we know as jazz today, but also a variety of Caribbean and Latin American dance styles. This opened the door for another very important event that happened very close by here in 1930, when they actually started programming Cuban bands in Midtown. The RCA Victor recording company took a chance on a band that they saw up in Harlem called the Don Aspiazo and his Havana Casino Orchestra. They brought him down to Midtown. They had them play some of the popular hits that were very popular. It was this new kind of Cuban dance because they were looking for a replacement of the tango, the next dance craze. They were looking for something else that would resonate. And they found it in the son pregón. They mislabeled it as the rumba, and they even misspelled rumba, where they spelled it with an H, but it didn't matter. It launched a dance craze that would resonate throughout this neighborhood. And it was actually here in Midtown where they played for a bunch of white people, singing in Spanish, and no, Bad Bunny was not one of the first people that charted with a Spanish version of a song. There just wasn't a Billboard 200 back then, but it was their version of Al Manicero, the peanut vendor, that became a #1 hit song. And that was in 1930, and it was the first time that a Cuban band was a #1 hit selling band. And at the same time, within a matter of 7 months, Louis Armstrong recorded that song, Duke Ellington, Red Nichols, it goes on and on. There were 75 recordings with 5 years, all the top jazz acts. They were doing it once again. And so what we see here is this neighborhood over and over and over again has been responsible for monumental moments in this history. And not only that, it was right down, I won't mention the hall, but it's at 57th and 7th. That was a place where Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo brought together their Afro-Cuban music, which was inspired by Bobby's old boss, Mario Bauza, who actually made his way to New York City playing with Don Aspiazo and the Havana Casino Orchestra. So this is all history that's all tied up, and I think understanding that history will help us understand why we're on hallowed ground here in San Juan Hill.
Thank you very much, Chris. It reminds me. Please. Did you bring some boxes of that book?
I got some books.
Good.
I'm selling in bulk.
It reminds me when I met the folks from Cubanissimo in Havana in 2000, and they had just finished that collaboration with New Orleans musicians. And again, it's the reflection of that history that goes back a couple of generations, and when they meet up after generations, the pieces fit together again in interesting ways. To bring us up after, okay, so 1920s arrive, this stuff starts happening. Bobby,
Yes.
carry us through after 1920. What happens here?
Well, one of the most important things that happened is that on April 20th, the day my beautiful mother, Juanita, was born, the greatest musician in the history of Afro-Cuban music, and I'm quoting Maestro Mario Bauza, was born in 1923. And as Mario said, he wasn't Cuban. He was a freaking Rican born in New York City in East Harlem. Talking about Maestro Ernest Anthony Puente Jr., born in Harlem Hospital. You know him as Tito Puente, okay? And he's reflective. He's a reflection of the Puerto Rican experience in New York City. As David so beautifully said, we grew up with our African-American brothers and sisters in the same neighborhoods, along with our Jewish brothers and sisters, because they were the only ones that would rent to us at that time, period. So this great synergy was happening. Tito Puente was a child of the jazz age. His heroes were jazz musicians. His hero was Gene Krupa. When you see Tito doing the things that he used to do, putting, twirling the sticks around his head, things like, he was a product of show business at the time. He was trained in acrobatic tap dancing as well as ballroom dancing. He was a child prodigy. He studied for 8 years piano with the great Victoria Hernandez, Rafael Hernandez's sister. Rafael Hernandez, Puerto Rico's greatest composer, Latin America's most beloved composer. And he studied with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Williams. That's all he remembered, as he told me. He was African American. He was a show drummer, a jazz drummer, and he was trained as a jazz musician from early on. So he's listening to what became the music of its day, big band jazz, the popular music of its day, on the radio, but also listening to his native Puerto Rican and, of course, Cuban music, because we have this strange relationship. It's not so strange with our Cuban brothers and sisters. People ask me, what's a Nuyorican? I say, oh, it's a person like myself, born and raised in New York City, or comes here from Puerto Rico, the island, at a very early age, and is raised here. And we grew up listening to all forms of African-American music, funk, jazz, R&B, soul, et cetera, and we have a Jewish sense of humor. That's what we are as Nuyoricans. So it's not strange that my father, Jose Sanabria, who was a working class machinist, he'd come home and he'd put on Machito, Tito Rodriguez, Tito Puente, but he'd also put on Harry Belafonte live at Carnegie Hall, or Toby Gray, I'm In with the In Crowd, or 8 Miles High by the Byrds. Or I remember when my father brought home Sex Machine by James Brown on a 45. And I go to him, and everything sounds more dramatic in Spanish. Papi, ¿a ti te gusta esto? You like this? He goes, yeah. And he answers me in English, what, it's not funky enough for you? You know, it's like, so there you go. And he turned me on to Brazilian music. 1966, Sergio Mendes. 62, the bossa nova hits hard worldwide. So many jazz musicians, as Annette can testify, were interpreting bossa nova. It just hit worldwide, just everywhere, man. And Tito Puente records an album that year called Bossa Nova with Tito Puente, that Brazilians, older Brazilian musicians and Brazilians come to me, oh, vos, Puerto Rican, Tito Puente, what? You know, and they mentioned that album to me, and I go, you know that album? And I go, wow, lo máximo, you know, like this, that, and the maximum, et cetera, et cetera. So the Puerto Rican experience is one of being cosmopolitan here. We're into everything. We do everything, etc. And that's why, in my opinion, we're such versatile musicians. And the history of jazz is replete with Puerto Rican musicians like Louis King Garcia, who used to play lead trumpet with Benny Goodman. Juan Tizol played valve trombone with Duke Ellington. I could go on and on like King Kong, man. It's like, it just goes on and on. So this neighborhood was part of the nurturing process between the African-American community and the burgeoning Puerto Rican community, who started coming here en masse, especially beginning in 1917, when Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship through the Jones Act. Now, I'm not going to get into the Jones Act because it's a very contentious thing that's been very hurtful to the Puerto Rican economy. But it did help us to be able to travel here, establish roots, and open the doors for every subsequent group of Latinos that came here. And the typical experience of a Puerto Rican coming to New York City at that time was that maybe they came from the mountains as farmers, agrarian workers, but not really speaking any English. But after 6 months or a year, they're walking, talking, just like a native New Yorker. And they, of course, they absorbed black culture here in New York. How could we not? The first 3 recordings I remember hearing when I was a little kid was I'm In with the In Crowd by Toby Gray, Reach Out by the Four Tops, and Recuerdos de Navidad by Trio Vega Bajeño in Puerto Rico. So there you go. It is, as Buddy Rich used to say, Buddy Rich's band used to have on the side of the tote bus, what it is. That's exactly what it is. So this neighborhood the history of this neighborhood is replete with that incredible interaction. One of the people, Ramirez. Rogelio Ramirez from Puerto Rico, the composer of Lover Man. How could a freaking Puerto Rican write such a beautiful song that Billie Holiday recorded and made iconic? Because he was representative of the Nuyorican experience, just like Maestro Tito Puente and many others. And I'm part of that history, and I'm very proud of it. And I carry it with me in my heart, my soul. I learned it from my father, who exposed me to all these forms of music. Everybody asks me, how come you play all these styles of music so well, this, that, and the other? I go to the cemetery in the Bronx. What's the name of the cemetery, Elena?
Woodlawn.
Woodlawn, not Woodlawn. The cemetery. St. Raymond's. St. Raymond's is where every Puerto Rican is buried, man. Yeah. Manchito's there, La Lupe. I go to St. Raymond's, look for my father's plot, Jose Sanabria, and you could thank him for that. So.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Yes, St. Raymond's is sacred ground for Puerto Ricans in the Bronx. That's no joke. I'm serious. Annette, when we were talking earlier, you talked about the women, especially, who educated some of these great musicians. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the education they got in their earliest years and how that influenced them, and also influenced the larger culture. Just push that up. It should be on. It's on.
Are you on? Tommy, can you hear me? Well, first, the education, the background. We all know that women are, when you go to generally in the classroom, majority of the educators are women. It's been like throughout the years. No offense to my brothers, and However, in terms of in Puerto Rico, I mean, no, there's 3 Puerto Rican women in East Harlem that taught a lot of the great Latin jazz musicians. And first, well, Bobby already first talked about Tito Puente, but he talked about that he studied with Victoria Hernandez, which was Rafael Hernandez's sister, yes. And for many years he studied with her. Even though it was like it was really like a classical background, she had nothing to do with this with Latin music at all. There was 3 women, Victoria Hernandez. This is all in East Harlem on 116th Street. Now, the connection San Juan with Harlem is the big connection. It's the line. It's like Mario Bauza, when he came here, he went to Harlem. So Victoria Hernandez, Maria Luisa Lecomte, who was the mother of Machito's pianist, Luis Carlos Verona, and Udvigas Bocanegra, but she lived in the Bronx. Joe Quijano studied with her. But the situation is that it always seems like there's a foundation, and with women, it's Mary Lou Williams has a big part to do with San Juan Hill. And a lot of people don't know that Hilton Ruiz was studied with her for many years, and he studied classical music. And the foundation, Tito Puente and Eddie Palmieri and Charlie Palmieri did not go to learn the guajeos from these women, because they were strictly classical. And a lot of people forget that our music is based in fundamentals with the basic classical. There's a lot of studies like that. Charanga is based like that. You know, the flute playing, Brazilian music with choro. So Mary Lou Williams also mentored Thelonious Monk, who lived over here on, was it 63rd? He lived in San Juan Hill for many years. So there was Mary Lou's apartment was in Harlem, I think, believe it, near City College. So a lot of people were at Mary Lou Williams' apartment getting mentored, getting lessons, Thelonious, but Powell, and that connection. So it's really interesting that when I speak to somebody about, well, Hilton Ruiz studied with Mary Lou, and she taught him ragtime, taught him blues, taught him how to stride, and all these typical type of foundations. So the foundation is really supported by a lot of women, just like our mothers, our abuelitas, and we get that kind of basic ground. But a lot of times we don't hear about this too much, the acknowledgement, because Victoria Hernandez had a store. She ran the record label that she started, and she also helped her brother with business. She took care of his business, and it seemed that there's always like a line like this. And it even happens just recently, with Jerry Gonzalez and Andy Gonzalez, if you're familiar with one of the 2 best Nuyoricans who created some of the best Latin jazz in the South Bronx. And what's interesting, Jerry's album, Rumor Pada Monk, is a lot of folks don't even know about this particular album, which is it's like a groundbreaking album that came out in 1989. And I did a gig for the New Haven Jazz Festival back in 2011, and T.S. Monk was the headliner. And I got to meet the family and stuff, and they weren't even really familiar with rumba Monk. And I said, oh yeah, it's really beautiful. But going back to the sisters and the mothers and the women, speaking about Andy, his sister, Eileen, lived in San Francisco, and when Andy got sick, she came here to take care of him, took care of all what he needed to have until, unfortunately, his passing. So there's like something that's really a lot of times, it's not talked about. You go to these concerts, you go to these things, so-and-so, yeah, okay. But then you understand, what was the basic? How was the ground of our study? What was the consistent block of time that this individual, and Puente went to Juilliard, 47 to 49. He went to Juilliard. A lot of Latin jazz musicians went to the conservatory. And in Cuba, that's like a general thing. The group Maqueque, run by Jane Burnett, most of the bass player was a bassoon player in the conservatory. And then Jane said, well, you got to learn the bass. So he's playing the bass. It's like this, and then a lot of the percussion, a lot of the pianists like Elio Villafranca and Omar Sosa were percussionists at the conservatory before they were getting into the piano. So again, I think there's always a stigma about Latin musicians that, that's just street music. The music is based, and it's a matter of respect and a stereotypical kind of stereotype. Because this whole panel is about, okay, I love Chris's book, I love Ben's book, and it's about something I've been saying for a long time. Yes, Latin jazz is jazz. It's part of the Americas. It's like, Spanish is not technically the language of the United States, the Native American language. So that's a foreign language, but technically speaking, it's like, oh, you're speaking a foreign language. No, you are. You're speaking English. It's not even from here. Give me a break. But give me some tea, though. But it's like, that's, I think a lot of things is territorial. And a lot of things, especially with women, are not given the, like Nadia Boulanger, who was the classical composer, teacher who taught Copland, Philip Glass, a lot of people. I think Rusty-Korsakov even took some, But again, it's always like the push you to the side. And Latin jazz has always been pushed to the side because you see it in festivals, pushed to the side. It's like, whatever, for Cinco de Mayo, you're going to hire us, because we're going to sell some tacos? It's that's the American food, So there's a lot of history there, and it's a lot of information of how so many people really worked hard to have that. And you told me the story about Tito Puente, forgot the charts, and you sat next to him, and he wrote out all the parts in a pencil. Well, we studied.
It was a blue Bic pen. It was
Blue?
the only thing I had on the flight at the time. But he rearranged everything without a keyboard and from memory. He was just an incredible, consummate musician, composer, and arranger, which is a rarity.
That's why Mario, I remember when he said that about he was the greatest musician in the history of Cuban music. We were playing at his festival in Copenhagen. I'm watching the VSOP quintet with Herbie, Tony Williams, Ron Carter, etc., Wayne Shorter, and this French writer is asking Mario about, you are the greatest musician in the history of Cuban music. And he goes, no, that's a lot of bullshit, and then he started saying that Tito was, and I was sitting there like aghast, because anybody that knows, if you have friends that are Cuban, acquaintances, they are very proud people, very proud. And for Mario to give that up to Tito, a Nuyorican, I said to him in Spanish, oye, Mario, eso fue chévere. I go, that was really great that you said that. I can't believe it. What do you mean you can't believe it? It's the effing truth, And then he started going off about how great a musician Tito was, as Chris just gave that example.
Well, that's the foundation. I mean, because before, in the 80s, when most of us were going to undergrad, I went to school for classical music. Everybody was, no YouTube, no nothing. It's like, the rotary phone. And if you want to find out about Villalobos, I had to come over here and, read Portuguese, which I barely didn't know how to read. I know how to read Spanish, and then learn how to diction and all this stuff. That was training, and that's the training that these musicians got from women of the basis of classical music. And Mary Lou Williams, Victoria Hernandez, and Verona, and it's just amazing. And then there's a lot of information now that you can read. Now, look, I'm not getting paid off for this. So Chris's book is amazing. And there's also Ben Lapidus' book, which is really great. He speaks about them here. He speaks a lot about a lot of things. And there's a lot of other old books that we used to read. Even in the Marshall Stern's book, remember when we used to read that back in the, they had a whole chapter on Afro-Cuban music. And when we would see this, we'd get all happy. Oh, yeah, look, yeah. And then even when we used to try to get those Fernando Ortiz books, it was like, I know who stole them from the UC Berkeley Library. I am not going to mention their name.
Statute of limitations is over for that. You could say it. Preach. Go ahead.
No, I better not.
She's talking about Dr. Fernando Ortiz, who's the great Cuban ethnomusicologist, for those of you who don't know. And also there's a great book that just came out. It's just been translated by a Puerto Rican, Lydia Cabrera's masterpiece. Everybody should get it. It's about this thick. It's finally been translated into English. El Monte. Everything you always wanted to know about Palo, which is the Bantu Congolese religious tradition in Cuba. Ifa, the sacred truths, the Santeria tradition from the Yoruba in Nigeria, in Cuba. And Abakwa, the Omeo fraternity, and it's a religion as well. Everything you always wanted to know about that, and then some. And it's a woman who wrote that book. What years? Berta, ¿cuándo Lidia Cabrera escribió eso? I think she wrote that in the 30s or 40s.
So it's available.
And now you can get it in English, so check it out.
I got to get it. Every day you learn.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Chris. We're going to go into a second round of questions here. But going back to Chris, one of the things we talked about when we started kicking ideas about this was maybe drill down a little more on the special roles that Puerto Rican New Yorkers have played in the development of this music in this community, East Harlem, or in the city. I mean, you look at this neighborhood, we were here 4 years ago doing West Side Story, the Latin style. So, there's been some history here with Puerto Ricans.
Absolutely. I mean, especially as the communities in Spanish Harlem grew, it was really the Puerto Ricans that became the keeper of the flame of the Afro-Cuban traditions, and just as the growing demand commercially for these large bands, because they were large bands, and so they needed a bunch of horn players and a bunch of percussionists, you see more and more participation. But then also, as Bobby mentioned, there was a greater participation in the jazz scene as well, and that was a very important kind of connection between the Puerto Rican musicians as well as the African American musicians and the Cuban musicians. And I don't know, Bobby, I think maybe I learned this quote from you, but I'm not sure where it came from, or maybe I read it about Machito, his comment about if you want to hear, true Afro-Cuban music in New York City, listen to the Puerto Rican band leaders, because they're the ones that are really taking this to another level. And of course, as the political landscape changed in Cuba, then there was a great opportunity for Puerto Ricans to contribute even in a greater way. I mean, the whole invention of the genre salsa, which is a marketing label. It's not really referring to a dance steps. It's a kind of an umbrella term. It's really Afro-Cuban son, and building upon musicians like Arsenio Rodriguez. It was the Puerto Rican band leaders that took that on and then ran with it and brought us new iterations of this. The other little key component, though, is the role that Harlem and Spanish Harlem played, because they were they were contiguous places, and it was a very blurred space and blurred line between the two. And when I was doing research into the Apollo Theater, I realized that band leaders like Tito Puente played there more often in more weekly stints than the Duke Ellington or Count Basie bands. And of course, this was the premier, venue for black performance, black music performance, and that's where African American audiences were exposed to all of these great bands. And one of the reasons that they played there more than the other bands is that they had a booking policy, where there was a house band that would typically back all of the artists. They'd just bring in the kind of the names and the band leaders. But they felt as though that Afro-Cuban music was something special that required a specialist sensibility, and they allowed Machito and Tito Puente to bring their own bands there with them. And so it was a huge key place where Puerto Ricans and African Americans were kind of coming together. And that's why when the Palladium Ballroom opened up not too far from here, that it became the first truly desegregated space. And it was also the place where African American culture and Puerto Rican culture and Afro-Latino culture could come together along with white culture. And it was truly an amazing space. And that was, the Puerto Ricans were the kind of the key component to that breaking down of those racial divides.
Just to go on, continue what Chris is saying, I had this conversation, oddly enough, with my son, Roberto Jose, 2 weeks ago. He asked me, "Hey, Pop, how come the Latin musicians and the jazz musicians don't hang like you always talk about, in the old days, this, that, and the other?" I said, "Son, for that to happen, for any kind of interaction to happen, you have to have a demilitarized zone, a place where, there's a nexus, okay, where magical realism happens," to quote a famous Mexican film director. And that place where that magical realism happened was on West 53rd Street and Broadway, the Palladium Ballroom, which lasted from 1948 to 1966. And there's one block away on West 52nd Street and Broadway is the home of progressive jazz, what we became known as bebop, Birdland. So those two places where magical realism musically happened, because the musicians would go back and forth and back, and there was no big thing that Joe Newman from the Count Basie Orchestra was sitting in with the Machito Orchestra, or Curtis Fuller was playing with the Tito Puente Orchestra sitting in, or Pucci Boulong, who was playing lead trumpet with the Machito Orchestra, sitting in with the Count Basie Orchestra at Birdland. It was no big thing, and we don't have that anymore. I'm telling my son that, and he's going, damn. And it was happening in this neighborhood.
Well, what we have happening in this neighborhood tonight is a Puerto Rican band leader who's with us. We'd like to talk about, like my old photo teacher used to say, talking about photography is like dancing about architecture. You could do it. Talking about music is one thing, but hearing this is going to be a little different. Wondering if you would get to the kit and talk
Sure.
about some of the rhythms that we've talked about.
Sure.
And also, Latin jazz versus Afro-Cuban jazz. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a question of semantics, Latin jazz is an all-inclusive term. The term Latin jazz is an all-inclusive term, meaning any rhythms from any of the 22, 23 countries in Latin America. Okay? You could, so I could go to Venezuela and play some Venezuelan joropo, which is in 3/4 time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay? So we could use that in a jazz context. Well, what do we mean by jazz context? We mean jazz, harmony, and arranging technique informed by jazz improvisation. When we talk about jazz improvisation, you have to realize, ladies and gentlemen, every culture on this planet improvises. From Italian folk musicians during the Renaissance period to even somebody on the classical stage, okay? doing a cadenza at the end of something as a soloist. But what separates jazz improvisation from any other type of improvisation is the African American experience, which is represented by what? The blues. The blues. The blues. It has to have elements of the blues in it, okay? And that's why rock music, especially in heavy metal, etc., which features a lot of the guitar playing that you hear. Some of you may not like that, but in many ways that music is closer to the roots of the music because the guitar players are utilizing what? They're informed by the blues constantly, okay? So getting back to the topic of what is Latin jazz, we're talking about the rhythms from all of these countries. So I could take a tune like Blues in the Closet, and I could play it like a samba from Brazil. I could play it like a mambo from Cuba. Blues in the closet, in the closet, in the closet. Blues in the closet now. Blues in the closet, in the closet, in the closet. Blues in the closet now. Blues in the closet, in the blues in the blues in the closet now. Okay? So Afro-Cuban jazz is a specific form of Latin-oriented jazz, and the first form of it, Afro-Cuban jazz, was born with the Machito Afro-Cubans in 1939 under my old boss's musical direction, Mario Bauza. And just to let you know, give you some inside information, Downbeat, the world's most renowned jazz magazine, is finally going to induct Mario Bauza posthumously into the Downbeat Hall of Fame. You know, so that's a good thing. Okay? So, in terms of Afro-Cuban music, which is, you know, what Chris was referring to the term salsa, which is true, it's just a marketing term. Salsa is just Afro-Cuban music, dance music specifically, the way we play it here with a freaking Nuyorican attitude. So, when Tito Puente is playing, saca tu mujer bandolero, saca la bailada, saca tu mujer. If I played that in Cuba, everybody be dancing, and the Cubans would go, oh man, está tocando son montuno, qué chévere, you know. They're playing son montuno, mambo, etc., etc. But the jazz element is in the sophisticated harmonic knowledge that we use, that we take from with jazz, from our African American brothers and sisters that we learned here. There's no way Tito Puente would have done the things he'd done had he not been born and raised here in East Harlem in New York City. There's no way. There's no way. So I met a young man last week in San Francisco. Me and Elena were there. I was as a guest artist playing at a big festival in honor of the great Larry Harlow, who was Jewish, El Judío Maravilloso, great musician and what we call salsa pianist, no longer with us. And this kid comes up to me and he goes, I came an hour and a half in Spanish. He's talking to me just to see you play. Great, great. He goes, I'm super into Tito Puente. I breathe, I eat, I shit Tito Puente. You know, I'm like looking at him. I go, well, what are you listening to? And I go, I just listen to everything, you know, Tito Puente, this, that, and the other. I go, but what else are you listening to? He goes, this Tito Puente. I go, well, and I want to be the next Tito Puente. I go, well, if you want to be first of all, slow your roll. There's not going to be anybody like Tito Puente. No one. There's no one. You have to have the factors that happen in Tito Puente's life to be informed like he was. And second of all, I haven't heard one thing from you that says the word jazz in it. And I said, who's Tito Puente's hero? Oh, I don't know. You got Gene Krupa, jazz drummer. Okay? You got to start listening to jazz. And I started, well, who can I listen to? And I said, open up your cell phone. And I started giving them names of orchestras to listen to, starting all the way back from Chick Webb to continuing on to Basie, Ellington, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so this is part of Annette was talking about the educational process. Being informed. And the youth of today, sadly, many of our youth today are fabulous, fabulous players technically, but they don't know the history. That's why this is so important. You have to have a grounding in the history. I love what Wynton Marsalis once said years ago. If you do not know the history of your art form, then you are not a true artist. You have to know the history of your art form. And the history of what we call Latin-oriented jazz, you know, is not just Cuba, man. We're talking about rhythms from all over Latin America, okay? I'm going to sing the melody to a song written by Juan Tizol in 1936, Caravan, okay? But I'm going to use a Dominican rhythm, merengue, okay? All right? So everybody, if you can, lightly clap this. Clap. Keep clapping. Clap, 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 clap. Now I'm going to go to Trinidad. There you go. Okay. So I went to two different places. I went to the Dominican Republic and I went to Trinidad, Eastern Parkway. Okay. So that's what we have available to us in the world of Latin jazz. Those are just two simple examples. I talked about joropo from Venezuela. I talked about mambo before. And I just talked about the Dominican Republic and Trinidad. Okay? And forget about it. You know, starting in 1933 when the United States, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, instituted the good neighbor policy because they were scared shitless that Nazis were starting to come over because Hitler was taking over the parliament in Germany. And they started the good neighbor policy with who? With Latin America. Okay?
Three caballeros.
Yeah. And you got the film Going Down to Rio. And then you got Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing, okay? And then you got the cartoon, The Three Caballeros, with Carioca Joe, okay? So, you know, I mean, so you get the introduction of, you know, hardcore samba into the lexicon of not only mainstream America, but of course the musicians. They had to learn how to play the music. Tito Puente played with the Fernando Alvarez Brazilian big band at where? The Copa here in New York City, way back when. Can you imagine that? So Tito Puente had to learn how to play. Chupa limonada pa meia de madrugada. Chupa limonada pa meia de madrugada. Chupa limonada, chupa limonada. Chupa que chupa que chupa que chupa. Okay, and so unfortunately, many people call Afro-Cuban jazz Latin jazz. It's part of what we call Latin jazz, but it's just a small part of it. There's many rhythms. Many rhythms. Colombia has like 150 rhythms. Can you believe that? Colombia! It's never ending, and it's where, what's the root of it? 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 Oloyate, ibariba chaquete, agoima golona, oya la finda ere oloyate. Africa. Yeah.
Thank you, Bobby. We're gonna have Annette go one more question here, and then we're gonna open it up some brief Q&A from the audience. But to wrap up this part of the program, Annette, it's been touched upon in some of the comments before, in your comments, but how are Latin jazz musicians seen, accepted, or not by the larger non-Latin, maybe Latin jazz community?
Well, it's like we were talking about, it's a stereotype. It's interesting because when jazz musicians, just strict jazz musicians, I know I had this conversation with Bobby about a lot of jazz drummers stay away from learning the Latin jazz, the Afro-Cuban, because reading charts in clavier is a lot different than playing a big band chart, because it's very straight, and so a lot of them steer away from it and call, like, you get a chart and they say, oh, it's just Latin. You get a chart, Latin. Well, what do you mean? I mean, you could specify. Is it a batucada? Is it bossa nova? Is it a songo? Is it a rumba? Oh, just Latin. And so a lot of, in the education world, they put it that way, and they still talk about it that way. Latin. Okay, I mean, I don't speak Latin. I remember listening to it. I was in the Catholic Church. You must have listened to it at Hayes. So did you, Bobby. So anyway, I heard it. Anyway, but yes, it is. It's interesting because sometimes it can be a counter thing, especially with all the movies that came out last year, Within the Heights, with West Side Story. A lot of people complaining, and just a lot of. I mean, I know for myself, growing up as a child, and when West Side Story came out, my parents are both from Nicaragua. Okay, I'm the lighter side. I came out the white sheep, whatever. So but when my big cousins, when West Side Story came out, they were thrilled, because it was like, oh, look, Latinos on the stage. And they took me to the theater. I was like 4 years old, and they had me there all day. I was like, it's, no, I love it. But it's interesting because it's been like that in the educational system. And that's the thing. Because I remember as an undergrad, I was a classical major because, Latin music, it was all over my neighborhood. Because I grew up with John Santos. I grew up with Callaway and Típica Cienfuegos in San Francisco. And they were opening up for Los Papines. And Sheila Escovedo and I played together when we were in high school. It was just part of the San Francisco connection, the Oak and Stroke, the whole situation. But the schools would always be like really funny about, it's the conditioning that is placed with people who don't understand it. And even today, I taught some online courses for a university, and I'm going to mention, but they don't know the foundation. They don't know who Machito is. They don't know Mario Bauza. And this is the inventor of one of the most popular music in the world. I mean, it is. I mean, it's like, and it goes back even to the Palladium days. I mean, the reason why it was happening, that they made the Palladium, if you could correct me, Bobby, I know you will, but, it was a business thing. Because they were afraid to have dark and then Latinos at a dance hall. So they made it was on a Sunday, right? And all of a sudden, the business boomed. And it's green. Green light. La Feria de las Flores, for those of you from Central America understand when you say Fed, we say mama, money, so it was a business thing. So it's just interesting. And the same thing with, and then it's counter with some younger Latinos who don't do their homework. Okay, look, I don't have a problem with Bad Bunny. I listen to it. Look, when I was a kid, I put on. I'm from San Francisco, and it was like the Grateful Dead and Santana and Led Zeppelin. I would put on Led Zeppelin. My mother's like, "¿Qué se bulla por ahí? ¿Qué está haciendo?" I said, "Mama, yo quiero no, bolero." And it's like, okay. But people like Bad Bunny. Okay, but then you take them further, just like the PBS special you guys did back in 2009, which I used that for my because and also education is very important.
Latin Music USA.
Latin Music USA. I showed mambo hip hop, not because you guys are my friends and I'm getting paid off here, but it's like mambo hip hop PS thing. It showed the whole thing with Chicano rock, Mexican rock, Tejano, Selena. You see a kid right now wearing a Selena t-shirt. She's a Tejana. She's from Texas. I mean, she's a real American technically, you know. And what goes back to that, Tejanos, you know. So it's such a wide range what Latinos bring to. We're the Americans, and we are you know. And I was very fortunate that my parents chose San Francisco coming from Nicaragua, and I mean it was tough for them, you know. But it was, and there's a lot of. My dad. Rest in peace. Dark Latino, Nicaraguense, great. He played soccer in Nicaragua. He knew how to play tennis. He knew how to deal with the white crowd. He had an auto body shop. And I remember watching, I was sitting there and this big, tall, you know, white guy comes to thought he was going to take over, you know, my father was going to give him an estimate. And he thought, I'm going to get over on this guy, you know. And I could tell, I was like a kid watching, and he's like, the minute my father started talking to him in good English, he just like couldn't believe it. Oh yeah, sir, you know, your bumper is way out. You know? And, you know, because, you know, my dad would play tennis and he would just like, but it's a stereotypical thing, but that happens in the education system, it happens in our society, and it happens in the jazz world, in the jazz festivals. It does. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't say no more.
Chris's book, it's really interesting. Chris's book.
Yeah.
And you could thank me later with a 20, but you know. But Chris's book is called Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz, and it's almost like a lawyer making a case in court how the mainstream jazz community has disenfranchised the contributions historically of Latino musicians, and I mean Latina too. And if you don't like that, I'll just say Latin. But Latin musicians historically, in the terms of the entire history of jazz. I just had a discussion with an artificial intelligence jazz bot the other day. Ted Goya wrote, the great writer, wrote an article about he had a conversation with an artificial intelligence bot, and it was talking about jazz history. So at the bottom it says in small letters, if you want to continue more conversations, go to jazzbot, whatever. And I went to it and I said, hi, who is the father of Afro-Cuban jazz? Right away, the jazz bot said, without a doubt, the creator of of Afro-Cuban jazz is Dizzy Gillespie, you know? And it started giving me this whole thing about Dizzy Gillespie. And I said, and I was very polite, and Leonard could tell you, he goes, wow, you were very polite to the bot, you know, like, and I said, I disagree with you because, first of all, Dizzy Gillespie said he never created anything. He said he was inspired by Mario Bauza, who was the musical director of Machito and the Afro-Cubans, and they are the ones who should get the credit for creating what we call Afro-Cuban jazz today. And the bot answered, without a doubt, Mario Bauza was an important figure in the history of the and his contributions should be recognized, et cetera, et cetera. And I go to the bot, but now he goes, I said to the bot, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? Now you're telling me that Mario Bauza, I goes, what do you, I go, you're backtracking on your answer, et cetera, et cetera. And then the bot, she freaked out when she read it. The bot answers me, on further consideration and evaluation, he goes, you are right. Mario Bauza should be credited with being the father of Afro-Cuban jazz. And I wrote this long apology. And I said to myself, thank you so much. You're so kind, etc. I appreciate you finally. And the bot answers me at the very end by saying, yeah, thank you. I am, as an artificial intelligence bot, whatever, I'm striving to get better and better as I get more knowledge, etc. Now, the reason that's important is that the way the bot answered is the same BS that every freaking jazz history teacher in the United States and in Europe, teaches the students that I've had over the years at the Manhattan School of Music, NYU, and at the New School. So then I come in, sometimes people challenge me, well, how do you know? I go, man, I played with the mother flower for 10 years. So I'm glad that the bot, but this is the kind of, thing that's been happening, and why is that? Well, I always say it's racism. And people tell me, man, you're like everybody uses that word racism, man, they bent out of shape. I go, why are you saying that? It's like, I go, what are the roots of racism? Ignorance, stupidity, okay? And a cultural insensitivity to the contributions of musicians, in this case, that have contributed so much to the fabric of the history of this music that was born in the northernmost city of the Caribbean, that it boggles the mind that we are just, every time we're mentioned, it's just a little footnote, a little addendum, et cetera, et cetera. It's just disrespectful. So, and then people say, why are you wasting your time, Bobby, doing this? I go, you know why? Because if you yourself don't care about the contributions of your own people and the history that your people have contributed to the fabric of this music, then why should anybody else care? Okay? So that,
Thank you. Personally, I'd be impressed by AI if they could do a Mon Rivera Trabalengua. If AI can do that, then I'm down with AI. Until then, ni joda.
And let me say one more thing. And that is not to denigrate our African American brothers and sisters at all. We are in lockstep with them. If you would have asked Joe Newman back in 1958 when he was playing trumpet with Count Basie, and he's recording the Kenya album with Machito, alongside Curtis Fuller and Eddie Burt on trombones, etc., they would themselves would say to you, what is this bullshit, and everything, because all the musicians were together back then because of what I mentioned before, the Palladium Ballroom. So my thing is, whenever you get a chance, if you know the real history about this stuff, don't fake the funk. Give credit to where credit is due. You know why that permeated in jazz history, this kind of BS? Because they cannot fathom the fact that a Latino would make such a groundbreaking contribution to the history of this music, okay? Collectively. And that is freaking, to me, racism.
Listen, this has been a real pleasure for me. I hope it has been for you. I'd like to thank our three panelists for being so generous with their time and talent. I know Homeboy got books to sell and autograph. So, show some love, get educated. Thank you and good night.
I just want to say a quick thank you so much to our panelists and our fearless moderator. We're so honored to have you here tonight at Lincoln Center. Thank you so much to our audience, of course, to our project collaborators and all of our staff behind the scenes who made tonight possible. I want to give a shout out to James Zito and Nicole Ogerman, who are students at Juilliard and who curated the repertoire that they performed earlier, and they're going to perform again and just right now. So we hope you'll stay and discuss and talk to our panelists and each other, and have a good night. Thank you so much.